Hello, my name is Felix from Felix Thought. I am making this video in the sense to help people orientate and at least get comfortable enough with philosophical works. In this instance, this video is a generic guide to help people with Marx and Engels works. However, some books will require specified guidance on how to approach the work, or, more clearly, what they should keep in mind while reading such works. But this should serve as a general guide for the majority of works that I read and analyze. Note you may deploy your own strategy, as I have formed minds that rather would be unorthodox for some. But before I go with how to handle Marx and Engels for a good amount of their works, let me give you a general tactic to handle a good amount of philosophical literature. Why do so? Because the general tactics that can be applied to philosophical literature can find themselves being deployed on Marxist and Engels literature as well. Nota bene, this section will appear in any general or specific videos I craft, so as to give newcomers the chance of how to handle philosophical works. That is to say, if I make this same video again, if I include this section once more, that's the reason why. Of course, I will always have my specified guidance at the very end. I'll try to provide timestamps for such. The first priority when reading philosophical literature is generally being a bit wary with translations of any work, in fact. Does that mean one should find the original text and learn how to read it in its original tongue? No. You should be able to trust any work, but be steadfast to any translation choices and be ready to see, if reasonably possible, how others translated the subsection that the translator touched upon. Already it seems like it's all going to be precautions from here, but this is the only precaution I suggest. But that's due to experience of finding wacky and conflicting translations of works. And when I mean wacky, I truly mean wacky translations. The second priority when reading philosophical literature is to read the section in its entirety. Does that entail blazing through entire paragraphs without stopping to smell the flowers or rereading a section? No, it doesn't. But if a person feels not right with how the author worded something, it possibly has been resolved or is close to being resolved in the end of the section. However, philosophical works, really any work of fiction, will indicate clearly or subtly, if they choose to the reader when to stop and ponder what the heck the section literally espoused to your eyes or ears if you are listening. And, most importantly, the reader, including you, should reread sections if you still feel queasy with yourself in a section. It might have been answered in the section, but you blew past it without noticing such. But more on that in a few points later down. Now, to rephrase the second priority, how one should read is to be delicate but briskly move forwards, rereading word for word and understanding each word is put there by the author on purpose, even at first it doesn't tie to the original overall narrative of the entire work. The third priority when reading philosophical literature is rereading sections. Why? Well, for one, you reread it to ensure that you read everything and you didn't skip an important detail. Another being that it reinforces what you read so far, whether it be a minor or major events in the text. For rereading doesn't discriminate on these levels of importance. A big other reason, pun intended if you catch the lingo, a big other reason for rereading is to ensure that you form the connections with the previous sections, develop potential threads in the next following sections, and fully confirm any answer to any question you had in the previous sections. And well, to beat a dead horse, it serves to freshen up on subjects you may have trouble recalling. The final priority is to jot down notes in any section of the work, preferably on a notebook that's disconnected from the work and hopefully not on a person, but hopefully on an actual notebook. But no, really. For some, albeit I don't practice entirely what I am about to preach here, the sections you read can become loaded with many questions if you don't carefully read the threads that are being developed there, or you're not able to line up the threads as they develop. So, jotting down notes as you read, even interesting threads that may be answered in the section alone, or the following one, the one right after, of course, and even jotting down aphorisms that do appear from time to time is important when you're jotting down notes. In fact, they may be referenced later in the work, so it'll be useful to pick up on that page and connect even more threads than what one thought was even possible to begin with. Even when the author didn't intentionally mean to make some suggestions or claims early on and was planning to fully ruminate on it later, it is good to catch them early on and be fulfilled when the author does discuss them. I say, even if you don't make notes for the following reasons above, and once not in a class setting, as listed, they do take stress off the mind from having to carry all this knowledge at once. More importantly, it is in your tongue that you made the notes in, so you'll remember it better actually. But as an interesting remark, if you write down notes on the first read of a section, then reread it, to then make new notes of the section, to later compare these notes, you'll sometimes be surprised with what you have written down, what answers to questions you have answered, and how powerful the rereading effect is. Like I said, to beat a dead horse. As a final touch, let me remark on secondary literature. My channel, like Gregory B. Sadler, also known as Reason.io, on YouTube, and others, like Gregory B. Sadler and me, to all the way to secondary literature in the form of books and audio logs, often are filled with interpretations. So, what's the problem? The problem is that some of the time, this goes for me and Gregory B. Sadler as well, you get more of the person than the author you're trying to know and understand. So the best way to truly develop knowledge and understanding with the text is to read the primary literature, the work you're trying to read, first, and generate some thought on the matter, then find the corresponding section of the secondary literature that ties in with it, directly or indirectly, and read the author's thoughts on the section. Then compare your thoughts to their thoughts, reread the section, in the primary literature of course, and see what you learned from such. But that's all I got on the matter for now. And, well, that's all I got on the matter right now for how to generally approach philosophical works, including Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' works. Now this section of the video is primarily going to focus on the general suggestions you should keep in mind for those reading Marx and Engels for the first time. The suggestions that I think are truly applicable to Marx and Engels, and this can be said for every dialectical materialist to an extent, are they were dialectical and historical materialists, that had direct connections with the young Hegelians. They believed in the ideals of the Enlightenment project, that any word phrasing differentiation that came along with the time period belongs with the time period itself, and there's no difference to young and old Karl Marx, which I'll further ruminate later on. And actually, one more point that one should keep in mind is that they stood on the shoulders of their giants back then, and right now we're standing on their shoulders as we're speaking right now, if one were to consider in a philosophical sense of the knowledge they have accumulated and established in their works. As such, the knowledge they made belongs to the epoch/era they lived in, and the advancements of knowledge that they didn't know of, they possibly couldn't know of, because they didn't even know it existed to begin with. Let's start with the first one, albeit this is particularly forced and a tad bit metaphysical for me to separate the two. Let me cover what it means to be a dialectical materialist. Firstly, to be a dialectician, and I'm talking about uppercase D dialectics right now, one has to assume that all things have connections with each other, and that nothing can live in and can be analyzed in isolation, which is a 180 to uppercase M metaphysics. Secondly, one has to believe that matter is what allows ideas to come into being and makes real, and I mean in the actualizing sense, of course, of what we think. That is to say, one has to be a materialist. Thirdly, one has to accept that matter doesn't senselessly feed into the consciousness, and that the consciousness can in fact change the world at hand. But I'm going to ruminate on that later, and I can provide full reasons why later on. But indeed, both matter and consciousness work with each other, and both steer the course of history. But for the dialectical materialist, matter is the principle and final ground that allows anything to happen at all. That is to say, matter is what allows the consciousness to be, and consciousness is always subordinate, but influences matter as well. Fourthly, we are not lingual idealists, which we will cover as well in historical materialism, in the historical materialist section as well. That being said, we are lingual idealists because we look at how words are used by one group to be applied to another group, understand that words cannot be forced to signify something without a material condition backing it up, and that words can lack meaning because all signifiers are arbitrary. That is to say that all words are arbitrary and can be and can signify anything if given the right material conditions. The next one, albeit on the same tad-bit metaphysical theme of forced separation, is historical materialism. Without it, the theory of logic, that is, dialectics, and more importantly, dialectical materialism, is incomplete. And, well, most importantly, historical materialism guarantees that dialectical materialism can function right. The same with dialectical materialism to itself. Yet, historical materialism is a historically materialist account of the bland reality of life, considering the material world, the socio-political climate and ideologies of an area, how they're interdependent of each other, and how things relate to their pasts and lead to other events later down the road in recorded history. But also, that we see that humans can change the material world as they are changed by it, but we completely deny the liberal gray man theory of history that denies the masses and the base superstructure's role in making the person and the history that led up to the point which allows their actions, which allows them, most importantly, to be the great men in these time periods. On a different side tangent, we don't necessarily disagree with the history of ideas or philosophy, that being the history of philosophy from Hegel. What we do, however, is incorporate it in our analysis under historical materialism and provide the material background of why certain philosophies came to be and consider the author's ideology and philosophy in a work, or in a play, in a speech, or their actions anywhere in the world. On a final note, for the lingual materialist side remark from earlier, historical materialism helps here to showcase the history of a signifier, how it developed to its contemporary content, and how that content allows it to be used in the ways it is used as such. The third one will actually be discussing the young Hegelian Enlightenment project connection. Marx and Engels were connected to the young Hegelians by being members of such, a school of Hegel that denied the conservative readings into Hegel, but was ever more turning materialist by the hour, as materialism was, at that time, being more popular and incorporated in idealist philosophies. Thus, they would develop a materialist line as they were reading up and understanding Hegel's philosophy and dialectics, while also, in that group, understanding how to make a revolution in Germany with Hegel's ideas, as the conservatives made use of Hegel to support the rise of Prussia. For the Enlightenment project, considering the passing of Napoleon's military and legal legacy and the still burning embers of the French Revolution, it was no surprise that the Enlightenment project still had a great effect in Europe at this time. Despite Romanticism growing popular and reacting negatively towards the Enlightenment, it didn't stave away the rebirth of the Enlightenment project in the years coming to 1848, and the profound calls for equality, liberty, and fraternity were still surviving from the specter of the French Revolution. And Marx and Engels believed in these ideals, but knew that a real movement would have to carry these along, and they had to learn from the failures of the French Revolution, and more importantly, the failures of every movement leading up to the French Revolution, and the movements that failed after the French Revolution, and adapt those critiques in the material conditions that they live in to make better of such ideals and to make actual of the goals that were carried out in the previous movements that has happened up to their development. The fourth one, young and old Marx. This will be the shortest point I make because this rumor and claim is unfounded. Simply put, a change in verbiage and no mentions to previously referenced topics doesn't constitute a change in personality or theoretical differences. Sure, old Marx knew more than young Marx, but that's because old Marx is the culmination of all these works that young Marx had established in his lifetime, and there's no need to retread old grounds, lest there was a farce to the original tragedy. For first as tragedy, second as farce. Regardless, there's no demarcation point or line between old and young Marx, and there's no delineation between the two themselves. They're the same Marx, all in all. Now, to the final point, the limits of knowledge. Now, while this wouldn't be a surprise to people that read anybody but Marx and Engels first when reading up on Marxist literature, it has to be named in discussions like these early on. However, developed and robust techniques Marx and Engels could have made and had made, they still wouldn't develop everything and didn't create all the advancements that we see nowadays, up and including Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, but a topic for another day, of course. What is true is that they laid the foundations for future ideologies and philosophies based on their names that would later sprung up and take off with developing more theory in their contingent area in respect to the original foundational theories. Also, every work has a definite period that they belong to. For everything before 1848, this will reflect heavily on the revolutionary fervor that led up to such, but things post-1848 will reflect on the developments that had taken place after 1848 and the lessons learned from these revolutions. The same for the Paris Commune and any war that took place in the world that they could get their hands on to know about and to ruminate about and to add to their existing knowledge database. For us communists, to dignify Marx's and Engels' works, we proclaim that we can see more because we stand on top of their shoulders, because they are shoulders of giants, just like how Marx and Engels back then were with Hegel and company's shoulders, for they were the giants' shoulders that they stood upon and looked at the wide world in front of them. Now, because I covered the principles of communism, and I'm going to cover the theses on Feuerbach, let me just give brief advice when reading the works. Rather, I'll actually provide contingent developments that should matter when reading the works for the first time, and rereading it later in fact, or even just rereading it right now, if you weren't aware of these developments that they referred to, directly or indirectly, of course. The principles of communism was developed pre-1848. Regardless of such, it was mainly written by Engels and acts as a precursor to the Communist Manifesto. As I do note in the first video of the half-hour series, in fact, the principles of communism is littered with talks of universalities and particularities, though it's more in the background and never mentioned explicitly. But one should keep this in mind when reading it. And the last bit of notes that I really care to talk about such when reading the principles of communism is that they mainly talk about the problems they identified for their times, that the communist revolution, the communist project, would have to supersede if it were to happen in their lifetime. Of course, they won't be exactly talking about neoliberalism because it didn't happen in their timeline, and this is focused more in Europe, despite obscure references to everywhere else, because of, again, the revolutionary fervor at that point of history before 1848. For the theses of Feuerbach, it was mainly written by Marx, and are what they sound, theses on the problems Marx identified with Feuerbach and his materialism, and his thoughts he generated while ruminating a critique on Feuerbach. These theses would later be developed into full-fledged essays and would be more expansive and explicative of the original critiques Marx was developing in this very work. Note that also Marx will be critiquing materialism, but he makes it clear that it's a type of metaphysical materialism here, and what are the troubling implications of such. If you're not getting the lingo, Marx is critiquing contemplative materialism as developed by Feuerbach. The return to topics developed under the young Hegelians is obscurely referenced here, and Marx is assuming that people have read The Essence of Christianity by Feuerbach during this entire reading. At best, these were notes that Marx would later expand upon in his work German Ideology, and some would be later referenced in other works made by Marx and Engels. Most importantly, the Change the World thesis that is in many of his works, like the critique of the Gotha program. And for now, these are all the advice that I've came up with. All the advice for the thesis of Feuerbach, Principles of Communism, that of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and also for general philosophy. I'll be using this video as basically a template for any other work that I do make analysis of. If I have a specified reason to make a different video for the different work, I will make sure to provide the timestamp to just jump to the advice that you will need for the specific work at hand. Otherwise, the advice for general philosophy for Karl and Marx will be present for the half-hour Marx and Engels series. That being said, have a good day, and agitate, educate, and organize.